Islamic traditionalism vs. modernism, reinterpretation. Most Muslims do not even realize that what they are following as a religion is a collection of centuries-old traditions passed on to them without any refinement or little, if at all. A general impression, understanding, or belief is that, like the Qur'anic text, everything else is as well sacralized, preserved, and immutable. I must remind the readers that it is an extensive subject and would need a lot of patience to digest and comprehend, yet I try to keep it as brief as possible, informative, and fascinating. An increased awareness of the Islamic world as a single entity is itself one of the prominently noticeable trends. Both the traditionalists and the fundamentalists cherish the ideal of the unity of the Islamic world, although they envisage its realization in very different ways. According to traditionalists, Imam Mahdi will finally reunify the Islamic world at the end of time. However, intra-Islamic dialogue between Sunni and Shi'ite thinkers will most likely increase on many levels, yet continues to be used as a political instrument by both sides, providing an ideal opportunity for external forces to benefit from a weak Islamic world marred by chaos, disorder, and warfare. Readers should be mindful of the distinctions between secularism, modernism, and revivalism because these terms are often interchangeably used knowingly or out of ignorance. In this piece, I will humbly try to bring forth the negative aspects of traditionalistic stagnation, explaining why it is untenable in these times and the times to come. Islamic nationalism and pan-Islamism are also two contending movements creating chaos and division and thwarting the efforts of unification unless Mahdi's emergence plays out as prophesied in Hadith. Islamic traditionalism seems to be standing on the shifting sand in given times of intellectual reason and modernism, not necessarily reinvention of Islam altogether. Traditionalists will not be able to hide behind the fabricated fear of fanaticism and extremism that would be created by rational modernism. Here, it means reinterpretation. Here is another botched fear that the forces opposed to religion, traditionalism, no longer function only outside the citadel of religion but try to destroy it from within by penetrating that citadel and masquerading it. And that the real battle will be between traditionalists and so-called Muslim modernists. Flaws in the traditional interpretation of Quran. There is no doubt that early scholars of Islam and leaders of the community exercised a good deal of freedom and ingenuity in interpreting the Quran, using the principles of ijtihad, personal reasoning, and qiyas, analogical reasoning from a specific text of the Quran and arguing on its basis to solve a new issue or problem. Without an articulated system, therefore, law formulation schools sometimes went too far in using these tools and freedom. Due to this reason, in the late 8th century, C.E. al-Shafi'i fought successfully for the general acceptance of traditions from the Prophet as a basis for interpretation instead of ijtihad or qiyas. The reinterpretation of Islam is not analogous to a reinterpretation of Christianity, where the question is a theological interpretation of certain symbols. In Islam, reinterpretation primarily means a reworking and restructuring of socio-moral principles that will form the basis for a viable social Islamic fabric in the 21st century and after. It will imply as an interpretation of the Muslim Weltanschauung, worldview, picking up the threads from the Quran itself and making the cosmic symbols relevant to the socio-moral principles, a task not accomplished in medieval Islam, but that contemporary Islam requires much more than modern Christianity. For Islam, unlike Christianity, cannot be content with a mere theologico-philosophical vision. The voluminous commentary on the Quran in Indonesia by Hasbi Ash-Siddiqui, al-Siddiqui, is said to contain systematic accounts of the background of the Quranic verses, the occasions of revelation, a development that is a desideratum and without which it is impossible to understand the purposes of the Quran in the social and legal spheres. Although Muslims had not established the basic parameters for hermeneutics yet, the medieval systems of Islamic law worked fairly successfully partly because of the realism shown by the early generations, who banked on the raw materials obtained from the customs and institutions of the conquered lands and modified them in terms of Quranic injunctions as necessary for the formulation of their laws. Where interpreters attempted to deduce law from the Quran in the abstract, for example, in the area of the penal law called hudud, results were not very satisfactory. Due to this approach, the instrument for deriving law and other social institutions, called qiyas, analogical reasoning, also were not developed to the requisite degree. The imperfection and imprecision were due to the insufficient understanding of the application of these tools. Examples. In the case of riba, usury, the condition of tribes, burdened by incurable riba debts, threatening to revolt, is not mentioned as a cause, and riba denounced for its abominable exploitation against those who do not desist from it and a threat of war from God and His Messenger. When the reason for a specific command is not explicit, an obvious outcome would be resorting to guesswork. Other examples are slavery, zakat, and the evidence of two women instead of one man, etc. Continuation of slavery to achieve the merits of emancipation, the presence of the poor for zakat distribution, and that no matter how intelligent a woman is, her evidence would count as half of a man's evidence regardless of the changes in the socio-economic and academic conditions. It is a blatant negation of the Quran's purposes of social evolution. Is al-Din ibn Abd al-Salam al-Sulami, 13th century CE, rejected the unanimously pronounced ban on interest by Muslim lawyers. He also denounced rajam, stoning to death as punishment for adultery, and roundly declared the entire traditional material on the issue to be utterly unreliable. Orthodoxy. Traditionalism. Tenacity. Orthodoxy had developed an astonishing shock-absorbing capacity. Orthodox scholars were highly esteemed by Orthodox circles as custodians of Islam, clinging tenaciously, besides personal law, to two segments of the Sharia law, the 5 pillars of Islam and hudud, certain punishments specified in the Quran. Minimal Islam, and punitive or negative Islam. Ibn Taymiyyah was the only one who made any perceptible dent in the steel wall of the so-called Ijma'a, consensus. It is never detailed amongst whom and how many. The problem of ridding Muslims of a hard crust of tradition is a formidable one and must be faced, but the way out is certainly not to confront it with vagrant amorphous spiritualities. The more traditional Islam confronts these or other superficial forms of liberalism and revivalism, the more likely it is to recoil upon itself and the more hardened its traditional crust becomes. Philosophy. Islam has created the richest philosophical traditions to this day, heir to Pythagoreanism, Platonism, Aristotelianism, Neo-Pythagoreanism, Hermeticism, and Neoplatonism, and aware of many branches of Stoicism and the later schools of Hellenistic thought. Currently, the prevailing idea of philosophy as skepticism and doubt, as an individualistic activity of man as a being who has rebelled against God, and as the objectivization of the limitations of the particular kind of human being called philosopher, should be removed and replaced by the idea of wisdom, universality, conviction, and the superindividual character of truth, so that philosophy becomes identified with an enduring intellectual perspective, as it has always been in the East, rather than with an individualistic interpretation of reality, as has been the case in Western philosophy since Descartes. Philosophy is, however, a perennial intellectual need, and it must be allowed to flourish both for its own sake and for the sake of other disciplines, since it instills a much-needed analytical critical spirit and generates new ideas that become significant intellectual tools for other sciences, not least for religion and theology. Therefore, people who deprive themselves of philosophy necessarily expose themselves to starvation in terms of fresh ideas. It is like committing intellectual suicide. In the subjective domain, in post-medieval philosophy, there is nothing higher in man than his reason, and nothing is higher in the objective world than what that reason could comprehend with the help of normal human senses. Man must go beyond himself than the scholastic saying, homo non propria humanus et superhumanus est. It means that to be properly human, a man must be more than human. Homo Islamicus is the crown of creation, Ashraf al-Makhluqat. He has not evolved from the lower forms of life. Though he lives on earth, he is not a terrestrial being and simultaneously has earthly and spiritual needs. He rules the earth not in his own right but as God's vicegerent before all creations. He is aware of the eschatological realities, knowing that he is here as a traveler far away from his original abode. Intellectual sciences. Aqli. In certain parts of the Arab world, The intellectual sciences ceased to be taught after the 8th/14th century, while in Persia and Turkish centers, as well as in the Indian subcontinent, continued until much later. Transmitted knowledge is called naqli. Philosophy itself cannot create any beliefs about reality or its nature, since its function is to analyze data of experience, sense experience, aesthetic experience, or religious experience. Philosophy, therefore, is not a rival of theology but helpful to it in building a worldview based on the Quran and Sunnah. Indoctrination in the sense of brainwashing technique of creating future generations of the faithful, in fact, ultimately backfires. Unless the material of the Quran is carefully systematized, it can be dangerous and misleading to apply individual and isolated verses to situations, as most Muslim preachers and even many intellectuals tend to do. The views of the Quran will also remain at the level of pure abstraction without thorough scrutiny of the relevant social data. For the theological or metaphysical statements of the Quran, the specific revelational background is not necessary, as it is for its social legal pronouncements, nor do the commentators usually give it, but without a systematic study, the Qur'anic worldview cannot emerge. Should the process of reinterpretation stop, society must either stagnate or rebel and take the road to secularism. In either case, the whole structure of theology, morality, and law will eventually collapse. Therefore, by and large, and despite the survival of centers of activity of the intellectual sciences in certain areas, especially in Persia and the Indian subcontinent, when Islamic thinkers espousing fideism confronted the West, facing specifically rational and intellectual challenges of the modern world, tackled them from a defensive or apologetic perspective, resorting to either fanaticism or by taking refuge in the emotional aspect of faith alone. The result could not but have been catastrophic. The world of Islamic religious scholars has not produced its Ibn Sinas, al-Barunis, or al-Ghazalis. The response has echoed, for the most part, the fideism and voluntarism that have dominated the religious centers of learning. During the past few decades, Islamic thinkers have begun to confront this problem more fully and to come to terms with not only the social but also the intellectual and cultural challenges of the West. The relevant authorities throughout the Islamic world have come to realize the importance of the re-Islamization of the thought, educational system, and the integration of the modern sciences into the Islamic worldview. The intellectual challenges posed by the modern world can only be answered by understanding the nature of these challenges and, by applying intellectual principles of the Islamic tradition to counter these challenges and the premises opposing the sacred universe of Islam. The modernism challenges cannot be tackled effectively without the Islamic intellectual and spiritual traditions fully resuscitated. It is wrong to assume that only the spiritual, inward, and esoteric aspects of religion can provide the remedy for the cracks which appeared in the wall of exoteric religion because of the attacks of anti-traditional secular forces. Sufi thinking. Sufi thinkers and leaders see themselves not so much as opponents of Sharia-minded piety championed by the ulama, but more as the proponents of an inner, esoteric, or simply more spiritual understanding and observance of the external, exoteric, or orthoprax traditions of the Sharia codified and cultivated by the ulama. Many great legal and religious scholars within ulama's scholarly traditions have been members of Sufi orders and authored works important to both camps. Utopian views. Modernist and atheistic concept of modernizing Islam. Modernists. Modernist Muslims have often contended that the Quran gives us the principles while the Sunnah and reason embody these fundamentals in concrete solutions. It is, however, considerably less than a half-truth and is misleading. If we look at the Quran, it does not, in fact, give many general principles, but for the most part, it provides solutions to and rulings upon specific and concrete historical issues. It, explicitly or implicitly, provides rationales behind these solutions and rulings, from which general principles can be deduced. Utopianism seeks, on the other hand, to establish a perfect social order through purely human means. It disregards the presence of evil in the world in the theological sense and aims at doing good without God. Farabi describes the virtuous society in Arabic or al-Madinat al-Fadai law. Sheikh Shihab al-Din Surawardi, in Persian, called the land of perfection N-A-Kuja Abad. Modernists, not secularists. Islamic intellectualism is the growth of a genuine, original, and adequate Islamic thought that must provide the real criterion for judging the success or failure of a correct hermeneutics of the Quran, the Hadith corpus, and Sunnah. The medieval systems of Islamic law worked well, partly because of the realism shown by the early generations, who banked on the raw materials obtained from the customs and institutions of the conquered lands and modified them in terms of Qur'anic injunctions as necessary for the formulation of their laws. However, the deduction of laws attempted in abstraction from the Quran was not successful at all. The imperfection and imprecision of these tools were due to the lack of an adequate understanding of the Quran itself. The underlying unity of the Quran was disregarded in fixing the words of various verses in isolation, resulting in an atomistic approach, and the laws so derived were not legal in their intent. The thousand-year-old ulama tradition, despite its stagnation in the later centuries, had nevertheless a rich and highly sophisticated heritage. The commentators lost their grasp on the basis of the sciences and were often experts in their fields up to their minutiae. The new education could not be integrated with the old, since the representatives of old traditionalist education did not want it, nor did the protagonists of the new education. For this reason, the two remained mostly segregated for a long time, and in many countries they still are. The factor of colonial subjugation resulting in psychological, economic, and political inferiority has a lot to do with this conservatism and resistance to the integration of the two. It adversely affected dominant Sunni theology, especially that of Asha'arite absorbing the foreign elements through scholars and Sufis. It was not wholly antagonistic to the Quran but certainly alien to it. In building any genuine and viable Islamic set of laws and institutions, there must be a twofold movement. First, one must move from the concrete case treatment of the Quran to take the necessary and relevant social conditions of that time into account to the general principles upon which the entire teaching converges. Second, from this general level, there must be a movement back to specific legislation, considering the necessary and relevant social conditions now being obtained. Islamic law is not strictly speaking law because much of it embodies moral and quasi-moral precepts not enforceable in any court. Further, Islamic law, though a specific part of it, came to be enforced almost uniformly throughout the Muslim world as a body of legal opinions or an endless discussion on the duties of a Muslim rather than a neatly formulated code or codes. It once again requires careful study of the present situation and the required changes to determine the priorities and the implementation of the Quranic values afresh. It will make the Quran's imperatives alive and effective once again. Both moves are intellectual and moral jihad, technically ijtihad. Muslim modernists as distinguished from secularists, and it should also be borne in mind that secret naturalism hardly differed from Sayyid Ahmed Khan's in India. Yet the opposition of the Turkish Islamists to Fikret was far less than that of the Indian Muslim conservatives to the ideas of Sayyid Ahmed Khan. Yet the crucial question to which we must eventually seek an answer is whether there is an awareness among the Muslims, and if the answer is yes, how much an Islamic worldview needs to be worked out today as an immediate imperative, because without such a predetermination any attempted to change the thought process would be futile. The genesis and development of the Islamic tradition emerged from the way the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet were understood and practiced. A quotation from Al-Shatibi will make us understand that after the first few generations, the interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah was handled not as an integrated whole but in pieces and parcels. The principle of analogy also did not prove as effective and beneficial as it might have because it was applied in a discrete and piecemeal fashion to two Islamic sources rather than the unity of the whole message, deducing laws and norms of behavior from it. In the case of Hadith corpus, a defense may be understandable since several prominent Western scholars have gravely doubted the authenticity of much of the Hadith corpus. However, no Western scholar of any importance has really cast any doubt on the integrity and authenticity of the Quranic text. The traditional learning of the ulama, unsupervised, / unstructured, makes them conservative, and the rise of a progressive reformer among their own ranks is indeed rare. In Iran, in the 17th century and the early 18th century, the intellectualist school of thought, Yugulis, won a decisive victory over the approach of the strict traditionalists, Akbarists, in legal theory. Persian intellectuals, a rather free and critical intellectualism resulting from a predilection for philosophy, have become a hallmark of Iranian Shi'a Islam in contradistinction to Sunni Islam. Thank you for using Panopreter Basic. It is one of the remarkable phenomena, however, that all rationalist groups in Islam like Mu'tazila and the philosophical Shia'a, who have exercised their intellectualism with astonishing freedom, have fallen in line with tradition on practical matters, keeping intellectual and practical aspects of life somehow in watertight compartments. The Ijma'a, or past consensus, has effectively prevented legal ijtihad, or new thinking on legal matters. Ijma'a is the most abused doctrine in Islamic discourse. The Muslim Brotherhood argued that the Prophet was never the center of an intellectual movement but rather headed a moral practical movement, and that the ulama and Sufis, because of their vested interests, have made it complicated and have buried it under debris. The argument is appealing and true, but the way it is presented to the faithful is fallacious. Because the unfolding of the Quran and the Prophet's activity took approximately 23 years, and 14 centuries have elapsed since that time, the problem inevitably arises of understanding what the Qur'anic message and the protracted struggle of the Prophet were about and what they aimed at achieving, which by no means is a simple affair. Ishtiyaq Hussain. Qureshi says, the traditionalist educators have neglected modem knowledge to such an extent that there is no scope left for a dialogue between those who have received a modem education and the graduates of the seminaries. The seminaries are doing useful work in the preservation of classical theological learning and providing ill-paid, ill-educated, and ill-informed imams of the mosques. Such education cannot help the growth of religious consciousness. In the historical lands of Islam, that is, the Middle East, North Africa, Turkey, Iran, and the subcontinent, rather precisely, in terms of Arabic, Turkish, Persian, and Urdu languages. In all these languages, the medieval style was artificial, ornate, and unintelligible, while the content was unoriginal, characterized by obscurity of expression rather than expression of obscurity. The idea of the Islamic State is that Islam is the total way of life, and is not limited to the 5 pillars of Islam as assumed by ulama, had been imbibed by Maududi, d. 1979, the founder and leader of the Jamaat Islami. Most people undoubtedly feared that if they were to study Islam in the West and inevitably learn and apply critical and analytical methods to Islamic materials, they would be outcasts in their societies or even suffer persecution. Even the application of modern research methods to Islamic history, let alone to the Islamic materials themselves, had been generally very deficient. Interestingly, the severest critic of historic Islam in the subcontinent was a person who had no modern training, Sayyid Ahmad Khan. Another towering figure was Iqbal, who was sharp and profound but was a philosopher by training and hardly knew any Arabic, and whose aim was not scholarship but reawakening of Muslims as a community. Now, however, there are a lot of Muslims who grew up and educated in the West, have embarked on Islamic scholarship, and are proving to be formidable adversaries not only to traditionalist Muslims but non-Muslims alike. The Quran had been accepted even by Western scholars to be textually intact, and the fundamental problem here is to evolve a valid method of interpreting the social content for modern needs. Hadith authenticity. Hadith corpus defense may be understandable since several prominent Western scholars have gravely doubted the authenticity of much of the Hadith literature. Sayyid Ahmad Khan and his colleagues had pronounced Hadith literature unreliable long before Goldziher's work came out in the West. Adoption of modern methods of research, however, might well rehabilitate much of the Hadith corpus and even give it a proper place and meaning in historic Islam. A great sensitivity surrounds the Hadith corpus, although it is generally acceptable that, except the Quran, all else is liable to the corrupting hand of history. A critique of Hadith corpus should not only remove a big mental block but indeed should promote fresh thinking about Islam. The proliferation of a hadith resulted in the cessation of orderly growth, particularly in legal and religious thought. Many modern scholars blame it on the 13th century disintegration of the Muslim world and the development of a static situation. The rigidity in Islamic spiritualism and intellectualism had set in long ago by Asha'arism in medieval Islam. Religious sciences development reached its crucial stage during the next two generations, the successors and successors to the successors. Although they were not witnesses to the unfolding of Quran and Prophet's mission, they excelled many of the companions in intellectual acuteness and were extremely sincere in their efforts. It was during this generation time succeeding the companions, the juristic genius of Muslims came to fruition. In terms of the alleged hadith, may God make that person prosper who listens to what I say carefully and then transmits it faithfully to others, for many a transmitter is less good, or no good, at understanding the meaning of my words compared with him to whom he might transmit it. Closing the gap between traditionalists and reformists. The original gap between the traditionalists, such as the Nahdlatul Ulama movement in Indonesia, and the reformists, the Muhammadiyah movement also in Indonesia, has almost closed. Some prominent members of the traditionalist core are now discussing actual ijtihad-based solutions to specific social problems rather than theoretical possibilities. Earlier revivalists. In medieval Islam, a series of brilliant and original men had built on the lines of Greek philosophical thought, a comprehensive and systematic view of the universe and of man, which they were able to synthesize with certain key concepts and doctrines of Islam to the satisfaction of themselves and many of the sophisticated Muslim intelligentsia, and gave violent affront to the orthodoxy on several issues, and since then philosophy has become a discipline non grata in the Islamic discourse and education throughout a large part of the Muslim world. In the latter half of the 19th century, Sayyid Ahmad Khan and Sayyid Amir Ali of India, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, Namik Kemal of Turkey, and Sheikh Muhammad Abdud of Egypt took on the traditionalists. I am, however, skeptical of the real understanding of the ramifications of the topic by all except Namik Kemal, who really lived in the West and was educated there in the 20th century in Iran and elsewhere. The intellectualist school of thought, the Usulis, won a decisive victory over the approach of the strict traditionalists, Akbarists, in legal theory. Asha'arite of Iran accused traditionalists of making Islam stand on its head. Thank you for using Panopreter Basic. Presenting poor reasons or bad arguments for what they believed right by following traditions blindfolded. Modernist, neo-revivalist, contribution. The neo-revivalist has undoubtedly served as a corrective not only for several types of excesses in classical modernism but, above all, for secularist trends that would otherwise have spread much faster in Muslim societies. That is to say, neo-revivalism has reoriented the modern educated lay Muslim emotions toward Islam but without developing Islamic thinking and scholarship within its ranks. Their target was the traditionalists, not the orientation of Muslims towards the Quran. They picked up selected issues mainly to address Western apprehensions. The neo-revivalist, therefore, is a shallow and superficial person really rooted neither in the Quran nor in traditional intellectual culture, of which he knows practically nothing. Because he has no real intellectual depth or breadth, his consolation and pride both are to chant ceaselessly the song that Islam is very simple and straightforward, without knowing what these words mean. Quran is simple and uncomplicated, as is all genuine religion in contradistinction to theology, but in a meaningful sense, it is as highly complicated as life itself. The Quran grew within a background, from the flesh and blood of actual history. It is, therefore, both as straightforward and as organically coherent as life itself. Eastern societies have been laboring under the false and complete self-deceptive impression that they suffer from an overplenitude of spirituality and spiritual insights while the West outstripped them in material technology and that now, they only need to get the latter. What seems to be fiction is that the East is replete with spirituality. If this were so, why should the East or the Muslim societies suffer from the mental and spiritual dichotomy? Saving the religion from the onslaught of revivalists, modernists, is not as important as saving modern man from secularism, liberalism, and atheism by inculcating in him Islamic thinking and scholarship through the correct interpretation of the religion. Normative versus historical Islam. There ought to be a distinction made between normative and historical Islam by studying the Quran's social pronouncements and legal enactments in the light of its general moral teaching, particularly under the impact of its stated objectives, on the one hand, and against the background of their historical and social milieu on the other. Context of verse equals Shan al-Nuzul. The Quran was not treated as a coherent whole by many Muslim thinkers. The metaphysical part, which should form the necessary backdrop for a coherent elaboration of the moral, social, and legal message of the Quran, in particular, received the wildest interpretations at the hands of the so-called esoteric school, be they Sufis, Batinists, philosophers, or even some mutakalimun, theologians, whereas, the majority of the orthodox became dusty dry literalists far removed from any genuine insight into the depths of the Quran. Quran, despite its distinction within its own body of firm and ambiguous verses, 3:7, which refer to verses of specific and general import, categorically states in numerous places that it is coherent and that it is free from inconsistencies. Indeed, verse 3:7 itself strongly suggests that the ambiguous verses should be considered matricial, relational, to the firm ones. Such an effort has been undertaken in Indonesia by Hasbi Ash'arite. I am advocating the elimination of vagrant interpretations, yet leaving the scope for private idiosyncrasies, that cannot cease because there is always room and necessity for new interpretations as an ongoing process. The Quran grew within a background, from the flesh and blood of actual history. It is, therefore, both as straightforward and as organically coherent as life itself. Key is, if a sufficiently direct and obvious text, called news, was available, the matter was considered settled for good. If not, then a text had to be found that was close enough to the case under consideration so that the issue could be resolved, based on similarities allowing for differences. Any attempt to take it with a literalist, partialist superficiality and lifeless rigidity will crush its gossamer wings to powder. It will be difficult to extricate one's feet from the stagnant waters of the old exegeses of the Quran, which may contain many pearls but will impede rather than promote the understanding of the Quran. Sha'an al-Nuzul, the general social historical background of the Quran and the Prophet's activity and its social environment, particularly the background of the passages of the Quran despite the divergence of accounts about the latter in some cases. It is strange, however, that no systematic attempt has been ever made, to understand the Quran, in the order it was revealed, to eliminate vagrant interpretations. Islamic legal system, though in the main unsystematically linked with the Quran and the Sunnah, was not founded on a systematic intellectual working out of the socio-moral values of the Quran. From its very beginning, the legal literature of Islam has a bookish aura in contradistinction to the demands of everyday life. It is almost a purely theoretical effort. However, according to al-Shatibi, no individual text by itself can have absolute probative force unless understood in the light of its historical background and the total relevant teaching of the Quran and the Sunnah. After the first few generations, the interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah was carried, not as an integrated whole but in so many different pieces and parcels. The principle of analogy also did not prove effective and beneficial because it was applied in a piecemeal manner rather than to the unity of the whole message, to two sources only for deducing the laws from it. The rationalist, Mutazilite, vs. traditionalist, Asha'arite. In Muhammad Abdullah's work, the theology is minimal, although he did much to resurrect Mutazilite rationalism. Sayyid Ahmad Khan called desperately for a new kalam, theology, consonant with the requirements of the age, and felt sure that, unless the theology is reinterpreted afresh, Islam would be in real and grave danger like all other religions. The Muslims' failure to make a clear distinction between the Qur'anic ethics and the law has resulted in confusion between the two. Taqwa. In ethics/morality, taqwa is usually translated as piety or God-fearingness and may be inferred as a mental state of responsibility from which an agent's actions proceed and recognizes that the criterion of judgment upon them lies outside of him. In conclusion, it is necessary to mention that reductionism, a core characteristic of modern thoughts, has affected Islam in its confrontation with modernism. One of the effects of modernism upon Islam has been to reduce Islam in the minds of many to only one of its dimensions, namely the Sharia, and to divest it of those intellectual weapons that alone can ward off the assaults of modern thought upon its citadel. The Sharia is the mainstay of the Islamic tradition, and the intellectual challenges posed by modernism in the form of evolutionism, rationalism, existentialism, agnosticism, and the like can only be answered intellectually and not juridically. Islamic thought process always depends on reason from both revelation and intuition. In the post-medieval West, those who sought to sustain and uphold the reliance of reason upon revelation and the intellect remained on the margin, and the mainstream of modern Western thought rejected both revelation and intellectual intuition as means of knowledge. Mathematical precision. Only mathematics among the modern sciences may be said to possess certain principles in the metaphysical sense. The reason is that mathematics remains, despite everything, a Platonic science, and its laws, discovered by the human mind, continue to reflect metaphysical principles, as reason itself cannot but display the fact that it is the reflection of the intellect. Comment/like/share/follow and subscribe. Shakir Mumtaz. Author, thinker, analyst. This audio file was created by Panopreter Basic. You can download it at www.panopreter.com.